Good morning. I'm Bob Shrum, the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics. On behalf of the Institute, the Political Science Department, the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, welcome to the next in a series of conferences that we're holding designed to bring together political actors, journalists, and academics to discuss major issues and inflection points. We have two changes today. First, Anthony Scaramucci, who is close to President Trump, phoned yesterday to say he had been summoned to a meeting in Washington. And Ambassador Nina Hachigian, who was in China when she accepted this conference, put the date and time into her phone there. And so she showed up yesterday, primed and ready for the conference. But we're ready today, and we have an outstanding array of panelists. Our aim is to proceed, as in all these conferences, in the spirit of President Kennedy, who called on Americans to disenthrall themselves from truism and stereotype, and never to enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Or as President Reagan said, the ultimate determinant in the struggle will be a test of ideas. That's why we're here, and let me introduce our friend, my friend, and colleague in this venture, who will moderate the first panel, Professor Dennis Chong.
Good morning. I'd like to add my welcome to all of you to the USC 100 Days Conference on the Trump Administration and the Trump Presidency. Bob and I hosted a conference in late November after the election, and everyone who participated in that event, I think, was a bit stunned because of the unexpected outcome. And now we're almost 100 days into the administration, and I think we're probably still a bit disoriented by the whirlwind of events that have been taking place, from Russia to Syria, wiretapping, the travel ban, North Korea, repeal and replacement of Obamacare, the Supreme Court nomination, tax reform, the list goes on. We're going to today try to make sense of many of these things with help of an amazing group of experts from the USC Dornsife College and beyond. In planning these conferences, a principal goal that Bob and I have used is to bring together in dialogue the perspectives and insights of scholars and also those active in the world of public affairs. I think then it's appropriate that this marriage of perspectives is taking place in this particular venue, which is known as Town and Gown. So let me provide you with a brief preview of today's events. We're going to have 4 panel discussions over the course of the day, 2 this morning and also 2 this afternoon, separated by a lunch break. Our 2 morning panels are going to focus on the state of public opinion and on domestic politics, and in the afternoon we will talk about the administration's actions in foreign affairs and also discuss the future of the Democratic and Republican parties. At the end of each of our panels, we're going to reserve time for the audience to be able to ask questions. So I want to invite all of you. I want to thank you again for being here, getting here on a early morning for an early morning panel in Los Angeles is always a challenge, I know. So thank you for being here, and I invite you to sit back and enjoy the day's discussions. I'm going to start by moderating the first panel. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. Is this?
Jill, let me introduce everyone.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. This panel 1 is.
Yeah,
I
hear you. Oh, make sure mic is on.
How's that? Okay. So the first panel is on the politics and polling, and I want to begin by introducing the panelists here, going from left to right. To my far left is Joel Pollak. Joel is the senior editor-at-large and in-house counsel at Breitbart News. He's also the author of How Trump Won, The Inside Story of a Revolution. Ange-Marie Hancock Alfaro is a professor of political science and gender studies at USC Dornsife, and she's a renowned scholar on the topics of the intersection of race, gender, class, and sexuality politics. Bill Carrick is a Democratic consultant and chief strategist for Dianne Feinstein and Eric Garcetti. To my right is Arie Kapteyn, who is the executive director of the USC Dornsife Center for Economic and Social Research. To his right is Jill Darling. Jill is the survey director for the USC Dornsife Center for Economic and Social Research. Arie and Jill direct the USC Dornsife Daybreak poll, which has gained some notoriety in the November 2016 election for showing Trump to be doing much better than a lot of other competitor polls. And lastly, David Lauter is the Washington bureau chief at the Los Angeles Times, and he works with and reports on the Daybreak poll. So we're going to begin with a presentation of the Daybreak poll results at the 100-day mark, and Jill and Arie will be doing that for us. So Jill, thank you.
Great. My turn now. All right, good morning. So I'm going to start and just sort of walk us through some of the findings from the poll that we just conducted and a poll that we conducted in April. And then I'll hand it off to Arie to tell us a little bit more about some of the in-depth findings. So I'm going to stay seated here because it's a little hard to see this from the dais there, but it's a little hard for me to see it here too. But anyway, I just as an introduction, these surveys that we conducted were among respondents who are in a national internet panel that we maintain at the Center for Economic and Social Research. It's a probability-based panel. We asked questions of them before the election in our pre-election polling, and then we did follow-up surveys in January, February, March, and April, and some of a couple of the questions that we talk about today were asked over time in those. Mostly what we're going to be looking at is the post-election results over the last 2 months when we polled in March and April. We're interested mainly really in looking into, rather than sort of investigating the high-level horse race numbers, headline numbers that I'm probably going to really sort of give you right now. We're really very interested in diving a little deeper and looking at some of the underlying reasons for what we're seeing and trying to get a little bit more in depth. So that's an ongoing project for us, and this is sort of an opening salvo in that. All right, so to start with, basically there is still the partisan divide that we saw before the election continues to persist after the election, in the sense that people who voted for Donald Trump, and in all of these slides that's going to be designated in red, as is now traditional, and people who voted for Hillary Clinton are the blue bars in these charts. So you can see when you ask about just this very general question that pollsters like to ask, because it's actually pretty useful, and it doesn't always, but this time very much closely tracks this partisan divide. But we see that there's a lot of optimism being expressed here by Trump voters, and the opposite feeling among people who voted for Hillary Clinton. And I'll talk about third-party voters a little bit later on. So right now I'm just going to be sort of going through this divide and talking about how we really are seeing a country where two groups of people are seeing things very differently from one another. This is talking about we asked them to tell us about how they saw things improving, or whether they were getting worse or staying the same over the next 12 months in a variety of issues that we asked about. You can see that for this is expecting improvement. There's sort of guarded optimism among Trump voters for, and I can't see the list from here, so let me just get it off my page here so I can tell you exactly what those are. The lists that we asked about were the rights of minorities and women, individual freedoms, threat of terrorism, jobs and unemployment, healthcare and healthcare reform, race relations, and the environment. There's quite a bit of optimism among Trump voters about jobs and employment, a small amount among Clinton voters as well. And you can see that this is very different from the response that we got from the Clinton voters, and this is now the percent who said that things are going to get worse. And so, you know, rather than even thinking that things are going to stay the same, you can see Clinton voters really feeling like, you know, the month ahead, and we're talking about the short term here, 12-month outlook, looks pretty bad. There's a sort of guarded sense of, I don't know if it's optimism, but I'd say the plurality of who thought that things would at least stay the same or get better. The majority that think that it's going to get the same or get better about employment, perhaps looking towards infrastructure spending in that category. So we also asked them to say whether or not they would attribute a series of positive characteristics to Trump. And those were keeping promises, speaking for people like me, inspiring confidence, bringing needed change to Washington, D.C., representing American values, is ethical and trustworthy, and bases policy on facts and good data. As you can see, he had extremely high levels of endorsement among his own voters and very low endorsement among Clinton's voters. So once again, a view of the president that is just strikingly different from one another. And this extends then to, of course, the deep divisions that we see when you rate rating his job as president, where once again we have pretty much equal levels of approval and disapproval depending on whether who they voted for in the election. This neither category, which is neither approve or disapprove, was much higher a month ago. So we saw some consolidation across here, and particularly among Trump voters, that Trump voters who were maybe waiting to see what the president would do over time moved into the category of approval just really over the last month. So we also asked about keeping promises. You know, that's one of the themes that has come up around the 100 days mark is, you know, has he accomplished what he said he would do? And people who voted for Donald Trump, the majority, 81%, thought that he accomplished as much or more than he said he would do. You can see that the majority of Clinton voters disagreed with that. But 20%, 1 in 5, said that he had at least accomplished as much as he said he would do. So there's a certain amount of giving Trump some credit for at least working towards what he said he would do, and perhaps not holding him responsible among his supporters for not accomplishing some of the sort of the large-scale things that he'd said. They could see him working towards it. Excuse me. So we, in sort of trying to get at the idea about whether there was a difference between whether people liked him personally or just and approve of his policies, we actually asked that question spread out this way. Did they like him personally and or like or dislike him personally and or approve of his policies? And we also gave them an out in being not sure about his policies. So as you can see, we had a high percentage but not, let's see, I can't even see that number and I don't remember it off the top of my head. Was that? 53%. Thank you. 53% who said of Republicans who said that they like him and approve of his policies. So not overwhelmingly so. And another 19% there, 1 in 5, who said that they like him. They're not really sure yet about his policies. Again, there's a sort of subset of wait and see. And then another chunk, 17%, who said that they dislike him personally, but approve of his policies. And of course, we did see some of that in the pre-election polling as well, that people were saying that they were voting for him based on issues rather than personality. The feeling among Clinton supporters, of course, 7 out of 10 disliked him, disapprove. And 20% said that they disliked him and they weren't really sure yet about his policies. They had to wait and see. And so we don't have a lot of optimism among the, excuse me, the third-party voters either. 59% disapproved of the job that he's doing. We had a high proportion saying that he's on the wrong track, disliking Trump and being not sure about his policies, and predicting things were getting there. There's a certain amount of optimism, but not a lot. Predicting things will get better in jobs and employment. 66% saying things are staying the same. So we didn't see much optimism about things getting better in the future among this group. And when you see this almost exact division between people who voted for Clinton and voted for Trump, the reason for overall low ratings that you're seeing in other surveys and we saw in ours for approval and right track and optimism about the future, really it's the tipping the balance are the folks who voted for third parties, the independents, and people who didn't actually vote in the election, but we're not showing here. We did see some small changes since March, as I mentioned earlier, among Trump supporters. We had a 10-point increase among Trump voters that brought them further into the job approval category, and we saw some improvement among not much movement among Clinton and third-party voters. We saw sort of an interesting effect, too, that it was sort of more detectable in terms of downward ripples and positive attributes for Trump among his supporters, people feeling like they weren't as enthusiastically endorsing that he had kept his promises, that he was bringing needed change, perhaps because of the blockage that had been going on. But on the other hand, quite a bit of the movement towards approval from neutrality was among people, the other group of people who really did see him as keeping his promises and bringing needed change. So that's sort of a division among that group of Trump voters as well. Oh yeah, which is what I just said. So we have seen, you know, that in many ways, really opinions have changed little. We still have the post-election era that generally you have a honeymoon period for presidents who, you know, where you have support from both sides, or at least a sort of a positive level of waiting and seeing. And in this case, because of the rhetoric that we've had since the election and all of the events that have gone on, we're seeing this persistence. And Arie's going to take it from here and tell us a little bit more about some of what has gone on.
All right, thanks, Jill. So I'm going to show you some more red and white, red and blue bars. I think that's sort of in the nature of what we do today. But I'll start with a, I would say, brown and yellow. We have done this poll for quite a while, and the underlying data set is a panel that has been around for about 3 or 4 years. So sometimes I'll talk about things we know from a few years ago, and then partly I'll talk about what we found just a few weeks ago. So one of the things we asked a number of times, starting in August, was how happy would you be when Hillary Clinton would be president, and how happy would you be if Donald Trump would be president? And since, as you know, Trump got elected, I'm only going to talk about Trump here. So if you look at August, then you see that you know, quite a big chunk of the respondents said they would really be very unhappy if Trump were president. So these are the people who gave a 0 on a 0 to 10 scale. And then a smaller number said that they would actually be quite happy if Trump were president. You don't see much change between August and October, but right after the election, you see quite a bit of change. So you see that people who thought it was really very bad if Trump would become president, it drops from 40 to 30. And the number of people who say they would be now are very happy is going up. And we don't really know why this is, but you can sort of imagine how this happens. You know, on Wednesday after the election, you always thought it was terrible if Trump would become president, and then you wake up and he's actually president, and you may decide, you know, the sky hasn't fallen in, so maybe life isn't as bad as you thought. And so but it's really just an interpretation. We don't quite know what happens. And then if you look after that, so you look at, so the brown bars are, again, the people who would be very unhappy. You see then after the election, really not much is changing either. So the people who didn't like the notion that he will be president, that number hasn't really changed. What you do see, though, the yellow bar seems to be going down a little bit. So you see a little bit of slipping, if you like, in support for Trump. Now, you can also look at this in a different way. So what we do here is we look at just the average score on the 0 to 10 scale, right? So people can give a number between 0 and 10, and 0 is bad and 10 is very good. And we break it down by who they voted for at the election, and you see that among the Trump voters, there is a bit of a slippage. So on the 0 to 10 scale, about 3/4 of a point on average, the support has gone down. And then for the others, the Clinton voters, there's really no change that's worth talking about. Among Johnson voters, maybe a little more, and then amongst Stein voters, a little less. So altogether, my interpretation of this will be there's really not that much of a change. There is another way of looking at that, because we also ask people, you know, if the election were today, who would you vote for? And what you find is that the vast majority of the Trump voters say they would vote for him again. And as a matter of fact, so by the way, you may have noticed that Jill sometimes said she couldn't read the slide, and the reason is we're actually looking at the chandelier. So the part of the screen is I have to try to remember what's in there. So, but what you see is that actually the number of people who would say that they would vote for Clinton again is a little less than the people who say they would vote for Trump again. So in many ways, you know, opinions haven't really changed that much. People are pretty much fixed in their preferences. And there is some movement from people who voted for Johnson or Stein to other candidates. One of the things that Jill talked about a little bit, optimism and pessimism, is we can look at this in a slightly different way also. So as I mentioned, the respondents we have had them for a number of years. So one of the things we asked quite a while ago, we would ask them, you know, what's your current financial situation? How do you feel about it? And then we would ask, do you think it's going to be better next year? And you see that, and this is about 1 or 2 years ago, and it's 1 or 2 years ago because not everyone answered this question at the same time, but way before the election. And what you see there is that the Clinton voters, the later Clinton voters, were definitely more optimistic about their financial future than the Trump voters. Now we asked this question in April, and you see really a stark reversal. Now you see that suddenly the Trump voters are much more optimistic. And for example, the Clinton voters are more likely to say that their future financial situation will be worse than today, whereas that number has shrunk to only 5% for the Trump voters. And then, you know, about the same, there's not too much of a difference. So you can still also show this in a different way. So what I do here is just simply look at the difference between the percent of between the Clinton and Trump voters. So what you see, the sort of the dark red, that's before the election, and then the sort of vague, what is it, pink or thereabouts, is after the election. So you see that before the election, you know, there was quite a difference in optimism between Clinton and Trump voters, and then after the election, you say it goes the other way. You see it goes the other way. You see that now the Trump voters are 13 percentage points more likely to be optimistic. And if you look at worse, then you see that before the election, the Clinton voters were 6% less likely to think it was going to get worse, and now they're 11% more likely to think it's getting worse. So you see really a remarkable change in optimism, and realistically, nothing really has changed at this point, right? It's not as if, you know, suddenly the world has changed. It's just a different expectation. As a result, one has to assume of who got elected. And in general, the country is fragmented not just in what they feel and their beliefs, as Jill has said, but also in, for example, who they know. And about half of the Clinton voters, they don't really know anyone who voted for Trump, maybe a few. But then among the Trump voters, there's hardly anyone who knows anyone who voted for Clinton. So you have these different groups. They have their own circle of friends and acquaintances. They have similar opinions. And as a result, their opinion doesn't necessarily change very much because their opinions get reinforced by the people they talk to. And I think that's pretty symmetric among the two groups. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about, of course we asked many questions, so I'm just picking a few that I think are worth sort of highlighting. So one of the questions we asked is, because people have talked about alienation, do people feel a part of the political process? Do they feel they have any influence of what's going on? So we showed people a number of statements they could agree or disagree with, and this is the statement where the statement is essentially people like me have very little say in what's going on in Washington. But you see here that the Clinton and Trump supporters are actually pretty much the same. So it's not as if one group is alienated, the other one isn't. They're really pretty much on the same page. On the other hand, if you then ask them, what kind of opinion do you value, then you see a stark difference. So you see that the statement where people are asked to agree or disagree with the statement, I rather trust ordinary people than experts, you see that the Clinton voters are much more likely to disagree with that. So they're much more likely to put their trust in experts than Trump voters. And you see this even more starkly if you look at the statement where that says, well, scientific facts really don't help much. And you see that the full 50% of the Clinton voters strongly disagree with that statement. And you see that among Trump voters, people are much more likely to endorse that statement. And of course, if you sort of think of public discussions about some of the somewhat more debatable or scientific findings that are more part of a public debate, then of course you can sort of understand where how this plays out in this case. On the other hand, if you ask the question, do you consider yourself to be like most Americans, then actually they're pretty similar, right? So whether you're a Trump voter or a Clinton voter, you feel that you're like other Americans, and I guess that's not surprising if you only know people who are Clinton voters or you only know people who are Trump voters. But the America they perceive, the America they think they're living in, what's happening in society is very different across these groups. And you can see this here, for instance. So we asked people a number of questions about facts, and we just asked them, is this true or false? And by the way, each of these statements, you see a T or an F in front, and that's our belief whether these are true or false. So you can disagree with us, but that's what we think is true. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but for example, there is the question about, right? I can see it. Well, yeah, okay, thanks. So there is a question about whether there were a few million illegal votes cast in the election. And you see that that's a statement that gets endorsed much more by Trump voters than Clinton voters. During the Obama administration, about 9 million jobs were created. And you see that around 80% of the Clinton voters actually agree with that, and less than half of the Trump voters believe that's true. And to have one final example, of course, we have the long-running discussion about the Russian influence in the 2016 election, and you see again that about 80% of the Clinton voters really think that played a role, and then among the Trump voters it's more like 15%. So there are really very stark differences. Now, of course, the question then is, where are these differences coming from? And an obvious place to look is the sources of news that they consult. So we ask people, what are your news sources? And they can click on as many as they like. And what you see here, probably not surprising, is that the Clinton voters, they have a pretty broad range of news sources. They consult, like NPR and CNN and the national newspapers. And if you look at the Trump voters, of course, there is also variation across sources, but for them, Fox News is by far the most important, whereas at the same time, for the Clinton voters, Fox is at the bottom. It even gets more stark or more striking if you look at who do they trust. So this is about who they trust. And now you see that the Clinton voters, they trust pretty much every news source except Fox. And the Trump voters, and I'm exaggerating a little, but first of all, they mostly trust the White House, the Trump White House, which is now a category that wasn't on the previous one. But then Fox is a close second, and you see all the other ones being quite a bit lower. And it's worth to sort of explore this a little more. So one of the things we do is, so this graph, what we do here is we only look at the people who say they trust Fox, okay? So we look at all respondents who say they trust Fox. And then we look at how much do they trust these other sources. And what you see is that all these other sources, NPR or CNN or the national newspapers, they get a score way below 50%. So if you trust Fox, then you're unlikely to trust these other sources very much. Of course, we can repeat this game for everyone who trusts CNN. So here we have everyone who trusts CNN, and we ask them, who else do you trust? And what you see is they trust all these other sources, well above 50%, except for one, they don't really trust Fox all that much. You do the same thing for national newspapers, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, USA Today. And again, you see that the people who trust these national newspapers, they trust these other sources, except Fox, not so much. And then finally, NBC, the same picture. So what you see is that people either trust Fox and not the others very much, or the other way around. And by the way, you may note here that internet sources are not in here, and that's because we asked for a number of internet sources, but they really get less than 10%. So people may read the internet, they may look at the internet, but if it comes to trust, at this point, it's not a big factor. It's really, in many ways, you might say Fox vis-a-vis the rest. So if we sort of, summarize what we find here, then first of all, as I said, the traditional media are still seem to be the dominant source of information. And then there is agreement, probably among the electorate in many ways that they don't feel generally they have a lot of say in what's going on in the government. But then the country is fragmented in a number of different ways. First of all, as we have seen, their friends and acquaintances usually have the same opinion, so there is not that much scope for interchange of different ideas. And then they have different news sources they consult, or different news sources they trust. They have different opinions about the role of expertise. They have different opinions about the extent to which they trust the government. They have quite different views on whether certain facts are true or not true. They're very different in their expectations about the future, whether optimistic or pessimistic. And of course, all of that feeds directly into appreciation of the president. So, and finally, what's important, we haven't really seen all that much of a change. So what we have here is, and I think by now this should be clear given all the blue and red bars I've shown, and that Jill has shown, is that the country is really very divided in many, many different ways. And also, that division doesn't really change that much. So it seems to be reasonable to expect that this division is going to be with us for quite a while.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And Arie. What I'd like to do is I'll get some of the other panelists involved in the discussion of the poll. And let me start with David, because David wrote in today's Los Angeles Times and an overview and also some analysis of the 100 days and with reference to the poll that Jill and Arie just went over. David, I was wondering if you could put some of these findings and give some historical perspective for us. Party polarization has been a fact of life in U.S. politics for a while now, but these results show even greater disagreement between Democrats and Republicans than has been the case with recent administrations. And what we're seeing is not only disapproval, but we're also seeing a lot of intensity of opinion, right? People who strongly approve or strongly disapprove, and so the poll results, I think, are in keeping with the growing trend toward disapproval of the president among members of the opposition party. But we've seen rather dramatic changes over time. If you go back a half century, at the 100-day mark with John F. Kennedy's administration, over 60% or more of Republicans approved of Kennedy. Even if we look at Barack Obama, his approval rating in his first administration was in the mid-30s. So today, only around 10% of Democrats approve of Trump. So tell us about, presidential honeymoons. Are they a thing of the past?
That's a good question. So let me just start out by thanking Arie and Jill. We had a very productive polling partnership with them and with the UNRWA Institute during the election, and I'm glad that that's continued. It's always a pleasure to be here on the USC campus. So want to thank them and Bob and the UNRWA Institute and the Center for doing this work. So if there are two things that I would hope you all would take away from the poll and from what we've seen with President Trump and his standing with the country would be polarization and stability. As Dennis was alluding to, it was not that long ago that presidents would come into office with significant support from the opposition party. It didn't always last, but they would at least start out that way. And as I think Bob and Bill Carrick would probably agree, public figures' approval ratings tended to be event-driven. If you had a success, your approval rating would go up. If you had something happen that was bad, your approval rating would go down. What we found with President Obama after the first few months, his approval rating settled into an extremely polarized pattern that basically never changed. It would blip up a little bit. The bin Laden raid, for example, ticked his approval up a few points. The standoff over the debt ceiling in 2011 ticked it down a few points. But those blips were both small and temporary. Overall, Obama's approval rating was remarkably stable and remarkably polarized, even more so than George W. Bush's had been. And it appears that, that President Trump has continued exactly that same pattern of a hyperpolarized and therefore extremely stable approval rating, where those who don't like him, and those who do like him are going to stick with him. That's largely because the approval ratings and the political polarization have become consistent with a number of other what you could think of as tribal divisions in American politics, divisions of race, divisions of education, divisions of urban versus rural, the kinds of things that get to the question that goes through a person's mind of, I'm the kind of person who. I'm the kind of person who looks at the world in a particular way, and that particular way has become consistent with a particular political party, which didn't used to be the case. If you think back to the 1960s and 70s, there were conservative Democrats, there were liberal Republicans. Those species have largely disappeared at this point, and the two parties have become so much more consistent along these fundamental fault lines of I'm the kind of person who, that it's much harder for them to change. So you see this very stable level of approval with Trump. Now, with Trump, the approval rating is lower, stable but lower than it was with Obama, and that largely reflects the reality that the Republican base is smaller than the Democratic base. So you're starting out with a smaller group. So then, of course, the question becomes, well, what happens over the next several years? We don't know, needless to say, but there are a couple of things that I would suggest we can look toward, and things that will be critical. One is that not only is the Republican base smaller than the Democratic base, it's more divided. Obama largely converted the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party became the Obama Party. Trump captured the Republican Party. He hasn't converted it yet. He may, but he has not yet done that. As the poll showed, as Jill mentioned, about 1 in 6 Trump voters say they don't really like him. They may approve of his policies, but they voted for him because they disliked the other candidate more, not because they liked him. And there was a lot of negative polarization in the election, and it benefited Trump ultimately. That group of Republicans who don't particularly like Trump tends to be more upscale, better educated. The kinds of voters that we saw in suburban regions like Orange County here in Southern California, or like the suburbs of Atlanta, where the special election was held earlier this month, where the Republicans have been underperforming. So that's one thing to look at, that kind of fraction in the Republican Party. The other is the kind of thing that we've seen in the healthcare debate. The administration has been unable to get an Obamacare repeal bill through the House, despite the fact that it was a central campaign theme not only for the president, but even more so for Republican members of Congress going back to 2010. And part of that reflects the fact that Republicans have been able to agree on repeal, but not on replacement. But part of it also reflects some very deep divisions within the Republican Party about policy, and those are divisions that that Trump, to some extent, has exacerbated, because his policy prescriptions, the sort of nationalist, populist appeals that he has that he's made are to a significant extent at odds with other parts of the Republican Party, and you see that push and pull in the healthcare debate. You see it in whenever the debate turns to entitlements, where the president's views are significantly different from those of the House leadership and to some extent the Senate leadership. You see it on trade. And you'll see it in the tax debate as that unfolds over the next year. So as those debates continue, the question, I think, and the one that my colleagues and I in Washington are going to be trying to watch is, does the president succeed in converting the Republican Party and really making it his party? Or do these divisions between his position and the more orthodox Republican position persist and worsen, in which case you may begin to see his approval ratings move downward despite those the kind of tribal polarization that I mentioned to begin with. So those are my thoughts at this point.
Great, thanks, Dave. You know, in the poll, picking up on that, there's good news and bad news for the Democrats. Trump is seen as out of touch, but at the same time, we've seen in polling that the Democratic Party is seen as being even more out of touch with people than Trump is. We're seeing no regrets from Trump voters, but we're seeing maybe some regrets in the poll that, in the results that Jill and Arie just presented. We're seeing some regrets among Clinton voters. Not that they would have voted for Trump, but that they might have abstained, stayed at home, or voted for a third-party candidate. So when you look at the 100-day poll, it's not only a report card on Republicans, but it also tells us how well, I think, or maybe gives us some clues about how well the Democrats are doing in countering Trump. So what does the poll tell us about the success or lack of success of the Democratic Party as the opposition party? So I want to turn to Bill Carrick as a Democratic strategist. How do you interpret public opinion at this stage as far as how well the party is doing, the Democratic Party?
Well, thanks for that, Dennis. The reality is the whole entire political landscape right now is totally dominated by Trump. And the Democratic Party is obviously a little divided on how to approach that. How do you deal with Trump? We have people who make a strong case that we should be in continual and aggressive, active resistance to the Republicans. And there are people who are looking to try to figure out, okay, is there any way in hell we can do business with this guy on something? As Jill suggested, that's the largest opportunity there seems to be infrastructure. Although, as David suggested, when we get into these issues, they become rather complex, and there are Republicans who think infrastructure is to give tax cuts to corporate America to build things, and the Democrats will have no part of that. They want to see public investment in infrastructure with, at a minimum, public-private partnerships. So, you know, there's a deep division in the Democratic Party on how to deal with Trump. Now, on the other hand, Trump may deal with himself in ways that ends up being beneficial to the Democrats. Obviously, the big takeaway from this poll is the unbelievable polarization. The Americans seem to be trapped in their own silos, whether they're partisan, racial, geographic, or ethnic, and to some extent gender-based. And even to the point that the old cliche about everybody goes and finds the news they like is startlingly true based on the numbers that have come back. It's not universal, but obviously there are Republicans, Trump supporters who go to Fox News to hear what they want to hear, and there are Democrats and progressives who go to MSNBC seeking the news they want. So it's, you know, we're almost having a debate with people with two different sets of information about the world and the country. I thought it was the most intriguing weaknesses I saw with respect to Trump in this is the individual attributes here are quite negative. The big picture, we still see the polarization. We see an extension of the November election and people's attitudes on election day. But you look at the individual attributes about whether, you know, what he's doing and how people react to that and how they feel about him and his ability to accomplish things or to be consistent, all these things, they're really quite bad. Now, they may actually be predictors of where public opinion takes Donald Trump in probably the relatively near future. I would also say there's, to me, I mean, the numbers didn't deal directly with this, but, you know, the real question mark is he's now locked in to sort of post-November position, same place he was then. The question is, if he had success, David, what instead of failure on health care, what if he had succeeded in repealing and coming up with an alternative? Would that have taken voters who were in the Trump soft category, which you see plenty of evidence, there are some very soft supporters of Trump, if they start to not like the things that he's accomplishing, right now he's being judged by his failures. You know, I think maybe for the Republicans, worse than his failures may be his successes. I mean, just one of the subjects of the day, I mean, okay, raise your hand if you thought we'd be in a trade war with Canada now. You know, it's so his successes may be more damaging to the Republicans than his failures. Gridlock has also been with us for a while, but as Dennis said, but if you look at, we had in our lifetime, almost everybody in the room's lifetime, we've had two extremely polarizing elections. 92, which people forget, was a three-way election, and a whole hell of a lot of voters said, plague on both your houses. And Bill Clinton got elected, and his approval rating was in the 50s in the first 100 days. In 2000, We had the longest election process in the history of the country. We were still counting almost up to the inauguration. In fact, if Vice President Gore hadn't taken himself out, we may still be counting. But the reality of President George W. Bush ended up with an approval rating in the low 50s. So the depths of Trump's lack of approval rating are obviously unique historically. And his capacity, everybody moves off the bottom. And he's going to hit, he may move 10 points, and he may actually be, within striking distance of George W. Bush and Bill Clinton were in two very polarizing post-election environments. But that's not going to help him. That's not going to help him govern. Finally, I think David makes an excellent point, and we're seeing this. And so this wasn't in our poll today, but we've seen other polls that have. Paul Ryan may end up being exactly where Nancy Pelosi is in public opinion pretty quickly. Congress gets a lot of credit for gridlock. It's just inevitable. If the government, God forbid, shuts down, that is usually right on Congress. It'll be on the president too, but at what point does the interest and ambitions of the congressional Republicans diverge from Trump's own personal agenda? And we've seen, as we've discussed, trade, entitlements, tax cuts, and some of the foreign policy issues. We've seen stark differences between the Republicans and the president. We don't often have that in our political system. We're not a parliamentary system. It's not the same as the UK, but we are usually the partisans of one political party are very supportive of the president. Now, occasionally we've had, certainly during the 1950s, we had Eisenhower doing a lot of business with Democrats, and we saw Bill Clinton in the 90s do a lot of business with Republicans. We've had that dynamic, but we've usually, with very few exceptions, we've usually had, the Roosevelt-Taft split is obviously a case in point, but we've usually had partisans of the president's party in Congress be very supportive. So far, we've seen with the Freedom Caucus and the moderates, we've seen a lot of fracturing of the Republican coalition in Congress. And when we've had that in the past, or we've had rumors that, the president's gone across the aisle and dealt with the Democrats. Now, with the exception of infrastructure, I don't see a lot of opportunity for Trump to figure out how to do business with the Democrats. And if he's going to transcend this polarization and gridlock we saw in the poll, he's going to have to figure out some way to do that. Now, I don't think he can continue and successfully govern if these numbers stay the way they are. They have to change. He's going to have to find some ability to appeal to Americans outside his own limited political base. And so far, we haven't seen any capacity to do that. I was not heartened this morning when he was repealing the President Obama's protections of lands in the West from oil drilling through the Monuments Clause, the Antiquities Clause. I mean, it just seemed to me another irrelevant, niche-y issue that he picked up somewhere on the campaign trail as he sort of struggled to become a Republican president who could carry Utah. The bottom line is we're at a point, as Arie made pretty clear, we haven't got to the next step. We're still in the preliminary stages of this presidency where everything is just totally locked in the same place it was back in November.
Yeah. Ange-Marie, do you want to join in there? You know, when you look at polls regarding what Democrats want their representatives to do, they don't want compromise with the administration, and they prefer permanent resistance to Trump. And you know, I'm thinking, is that a viable strategy, for them over the next 4 years? Ange-Marie.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that I wanted to make sure we brought to the table, and I think the fact that we're doing this in California, I think, skews sometimes our idea of just how strong the taste is for, full-scale total resistance all the time. And I think one of the important kinds of conditions that maybe California Democrats and others, the New York Democrats and others need to think about is what happened in Kansas and what happened in Georgia, right? So how close they came in Kansas, how close they are in Georgia in the district, where Jon Ossoff is running against Karen Handel. Jon Ossoff is not running I'm going to resist, typical kind of, LA Democrat. He's not running a Maxine Waters campaign. He's not running, even a Adam Schiff kind of campaign, So I think that's one of the chastening things about this idea of should it be resistance, kind of full out, right? That we're going to have to think about the way in which different kinds of targeted policies and targeted campaign strategies should work. So that's the direct answer to your question, but I think a couple of things that struck me in terms of the poll data that I wanted to raise was, with regard to the second wave of the internet survey happening, that month of April, right? So first week of April is when Trump bombed Syria. We know historically that the idea of, getting involved in defense kinds of things, foreign policy kinds of things, does tend to consolidate, whatever support is out there for a president, right? So we saw this after 9/11, of course, which is far more severe, in terms of what Americans thought of as a perceived threat than, Syrian refugees, I think it's fair to say. But I think that's one of the things that might be worth kind of thinking about in terms of how that slight uptick, kind of happened for Trump overall in April. The second thing I wanted to kind of talk about was one of the bits of data that wasn't necessarily presented, which was the direction of the country thinking about gender, education, and race. And so when you look at that part of the data, you see that women, white women, both with no degree and with a degree, so white women in general, regardless of their education status, voted in, or still supported and thought that the country was headed in the right direction 4 months after or 3 months after the inauguration. So I think that there's an important thing, and my colleague Jane Junn has just written a paper about this, and we're working on a project together about this to really think about the way in which white women are this kind of lever for how we think about public opinion regarding this particular president. So I think we often think of the gender gap as kind of being a gender gap across racial and ethnic groups. And I think instead what we really want to think about is how do we disaggregate, right? And how do we think through these different pairs of, kind of Black women, Latina women, Asian women, as well as white women in terms of their public support. So here's what I think is going on here. And so Jane is sort of speculating about this in the paper that she just published, because she notes that white women have voted Republican in all but 2 elections since 1952, right? So if you listen to the mainstream media, let me just say that, if you listen to the mainstream media, you'll hear that the gender gap is kind of, again, across different racial groups, and that it operates the same way across different racial groups. And so what Jane has found is that that's not the case. In fact, those 2 elections were the only 2 elections where white women voted for Democrats. And so what we're trying to work on and we're trying to tease out is, of course, why and what's going on there. And one of the things I think is going on there is this notion of security, right? And so I think part of what made Trump's, appeal to white women so successful is something that was also true in the early 2000s following 9/11, and also something that was part of the Southern strategy that, again, we normally thought of the Southern strategy as appealing mostly to white male voters, but in fact, this was also appealing in a very nuanced way to white female voters. And that was this notion of security, right? Security and safety, right? So one of the things that's going on there is this idea, not so much safety and security from terrorist threats or other things, but safety and security threats in terms of safe neighborhoods, in terms of making sure that kids are safe, right? And those kinds of things, when those narratives are kind of brought up, subtly speaking, right, but are brought up, then you start to have white women making sure that they are consolidating around a candidate who is going to, quote unquote, keep them safe. And so I think that's something that the Democrats have not found an answer for. So here I'm the social scientist, I'm not a partisan. This is something the Democrats have not found an answer for, right? They don't know how to appeal to that segment of the population in a way that makes them feel safe, right? So Hillary Clinton certainly tried it in 2008. This is something I wrote about in my book, Solidarity Politics for Millennials, but it didn't work, obviously, right? So this is something that the Democrats have yet to kind of identify and figure out a solution to. The other thing that I think is important, and again, we don't often think about this, is that we should also consider age. And so one of the things we were able to do in 2008 and in 2012 in our polling, the Collaborative Multiracial Political Survey, was to embed survey experiments. And one of the things we found, and again, you think of millennials as being kind of, all across the board liberal, all across the board tolerant, all across the board have the same kind of social values as the Democratic Party. And what we found was that that was absolutely manipulable in the same way that it would be manipulable among Generation X and among baby boomers. And so one of the survey experiments that we actually embedded was this notion of increasing border security, right? So something that Trump clearly has been talking about, that's one of the things that he just removed as a condition of making sure that the government doesn't shut down in 2 days, right? This border wall. And one of the things that is appealing to millennials about that is when you start to talk about, again, those security threats, right? When you talk about the security threats in terms of it being security against immigrants, millennials don't necessarily buy the argument. But once you start to talk about it as a security threat with regard to terrorism, then millennials will buy it just as much as Generation X, just as much as baby boomers, right? So I think one of the things that's worth thinking about is what's the role of age here in terms of support of Trump. So I think, and again, speaking more to the opposition party in the sense of what can they do, because the Republicans are in power and so they have a large, amount of power to do what they want. Speaking to the Democrats, the idea would then be, okay, how do you actually think about this? Because I think one narrative about millennials is that as we go through demographic change, everything that Democrats want will kind of automatically happen kind of organically, right? That, whether it's LGBT rights, whether it's gender rights, whether it's immigration reform, as long as those millennials start running and start actually getting into office, then everything will kind of organically happen. And I think that's really a flawed argument and a flawed logic to kind of think about, precisely because what we see among those young voters who did support Trump was that he was able to find a way into appealing to them, right? And so I think there's this real important attention that needs to be paid to the role of age as a variable in some of the polling that we're doing. Because I think, again, the assumptions that millennials are kind of all over, well, this is my left, so all over here on the left, when in fact, I think, there's a significant number of them, whether they're evangelical, I have a student who's working on a paper right now looking at those young voters, or whether they are, not necessarily religious at all, but have this, I'm concerned about security. I'm concerned about the future of entitlements and other things. So those are a couple of the things that I saw in the data that was presented today that are worth kind of thinking about. And then the last thing, I wanted to just kind of make sure we raise is really thinking about the role of state and local politics. And so different states are positioning themselves differently. And so I think one of the interesting questions going forward is to really think about the role of federalism. So if you think about what has just happened here up north with the federal judge blocking the threat to, prevent funding to sanctuary cities, I think there's some interesting questions of federalism going forward. And it's, for me, as a political scientist, it's particularly interesting to watch because, of course, this was what happened with Obamacare in 2009 and 2010, when the Democrats are in power and now the Republicans are in power. And there's this interesting federalism argument. So I think one of the things that is worth kind of going forward to look at is this notion of how is federalism either going to hopefully save our democracy, right, in terms of making sure that the worst abuses of either party can't really, end up harming the people that live here, or, is federalism eventually going to be something that cannot save us? So I think that's one of the interesting questions to kind of think about going forward.
And Joel, I want to get you involved here. And I want you to maybe talk about, what does the poll say about Trump's power within his party? Can his support hold up indefinitely without, what people are calling for, like more significant legislative accomplishments? Or, I'm kind of wondering if there's a certain cult of personality behind him, and that will sustain his support for a long time.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. And, when you introduced me, you said I was on the far left. But, at Breitbart, we have slightly different perspectives. So I'm glad to be, I guess, the furthest on the right on the panel. And I think, let me give you a sense of before I answer your question, let me give you a sense of overall where I think our readers are at. And to me, what is the most important number in this poll? First of all, I want to congratulate the pollsters, actually, not just for this poll, which is very informative, but also for their performance in the election. And this was, as far as I am aware, the only major public poll that got the election right. And I know that the pollsters had to endure all kinds of articles from the New York Times, unskewing their polls and trying to get at their sample and figure out what they were doing wrong, because Trump couldn't obviously win this election. So they reported the data, they got the data right, and I think that's what makes everything they produce from now on so much more valuable, because it was a rare win in a sea of polling losers, so to put it in Trumpian terms. So look, the headline number to me in this poll is 53% overall, not just of Trump supporters, but the overall sample, 53% say that he's keeping his promises. That is very significant. And that drives the optimism that most Trump supporters still have about the candidate. Now, at Breitbart, you'll read a lot of stories about how he is letting his supporters down on this issue or that issue. Breitbart surprised a lot of people who thought we were just sort of pro-Trump, surprised a lot of people by taking him to task from day one. One of his promises at almost every campaign rally was, I'm going to investigate or prosecute Hillary Clinton, and then he dropped that almost immediately after winning the election, and that was a big blaring headline on Breitbart. First promise broken. And people in the media world reported that as, wow, Breitbart's turning on Trump. We're not turning on Trump. We always spoke for that audience. We always, our readers basically came to us for news that reflected their outlook on the world, and their outlook hasn't changed. These are still the things they want done. They want jobs, of course, but they also want Obamacare repealed and so forth. And anytime there's a lack of progress on these initiatives or any kind of a flip-flop or perceived flip-flop, there's a strong reaction. But in general, even the most inclined to be offended by anything Trump does that isn't conservative still think he's basically doing his job. And let me give you a sense of why I'm bullish on the first 100 days. And I think this is probably how most Trump supporters see it. First of all, no major disasters. A lot of things people are angry about, okay. No major disasters. Maybe that's not because of him. Maybe Obama did a great job for 8 years and handed off something working good. Whatever it was, there's no major disasters, so people aren't going to panic about the first 100 days. That sort of gets him halfway there. Then you've got the appointment of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, which perhaps any Republican president would have appointed him or someone like him, but he basically covered the bases. The country didn't fall apart. There wasn't a major catastrophe, and he put a conservative on the Supreme Court. That kind of gets him a gentleman's C before he's done anything else. He's got a C grade. So he passes, he's doing okay. But then you add some of the other things he's done that are really unique. The most important legislatively, we've heard a lot of talk about the health care bill not going through. In fact, news just broke that the Freedom Caucus is now signing on to the new version of the health care bill, so we'll see where that goes. But okay, so he dropped the ball there first 100 days so far anyway. But he signed 13 bills into law that repeal Obama regulations. Some of these might seem obscure, or some of them might not be of interest, but to certain interest groups, they are very much of interest. So I think Bill mentioned one about federal lands in the West. And to describe that as Trump's taking away protections from federal lands is to put it in a negative sense and focus on, well, technically it does that, but if you're living in those areas and you're relying on job creation in those areas, some of those new monuments were sort of created willy-nilly by Obama in the sort of last weeks or months of his administration against significant local opposition. And there's a huge constituency in some of these western states against further federalization of land. And so they are very happy to see Trump reversing some of these things. And there are 13 of these laws in total that he's passed that reverse Obama regulations. There's also executive orders to direct agencies to review some regulations. So he's basically taken a hatchet to the regulatory state. That's very good for his conservative supporters. That's draining the swamp from their perspective. And probably the most surprising development, but in a way the boldest, was the missile strike on Syria, which had some of his supporters worried that maybe he's going to turn into a quote-unquote neocon and he's going to start declaring war everywhere, and they didn't like that. But most Americans approved of that, and it reestablished America's presence on the world stage. It responded to the chemical weapons attack. It was a sharp contrast to Obama's conduct on the world stage, and so it essentially marked one of several moves Trump has taken to reestablish the United States as a force, as a leader from the front in world politics, whereas Obama's approach had been leading from behind. And you take all those things together, that's a significant pile of achievements in the first 100 days. He hasn't achieved everything he's promised, and you can point to a lot of things he's done that were against things he said on the campaign trail. Some of that Trump supporters are used to. Trump supporters didn't necessarily take everything he said seriously, particularly when he said certain things were going to be easy. He would say, oh, we're going to solve this NAFTA thing, it's going to be easy. I don't know how many people actually believed him when he said he was going to be easy. Probably most people found it entertaining. There's a significant amount of leeway Trump supporters are willing to give him, just as, if you want to think about an analogous case, a significant amount of leeway Obama supporters are willing to give him. Obama promised his supporters that the rise of the oceans would slow and the planet would begin to heal. Well, you know, the rise of the oceans didn't slow, and you know, other things didn't happen, but Obama supporters were still on board. Some really interesting things were said on this panel, and I really value some of these insights. I'm going to pick on a couple of them because I think they're really important to understanding where we go from here. So one of the comments earlier was that there are about 1/6 of Trump voters who don't like him. There's some personal attributes of him they don't like, but they voted for him anyway because they didn't like the other candidate. Now, if I'm a Democratic strategist, I'm thinking, wow, that is who I'm targeting. I'm going after that 1/6, and I'm going to find whatever it is they don't like about Trump, and I'm going to amplify it. But here's the thing. They voted for Trump anyway, knowing all the stuff about his rhetoric and the Access Hollywood video and all the nasty stuff that people keep recycling now, 3-4 months into his presidency. They knew all that, and they still voted for him. So what they don't like about Trump has to be something different. And if you want to know what that is, you might want to read Breitbart. I mean, one of the things that some of his voters don't like is they didn't think he was going to be a real conservative. And every time he breaks one of these minor promises, he's creating a new potential source of opposition. Now, Democrats aren't going to go out there and promise to build the wall even higher because he hasn't built it yet. But if I'm a Democratic strategist, some free advice to Democrats, what I'm going to do is go to those voters and say, you thought he was going to drain the swamp. You thought he was going to bring change. He's just another politician. And our candidate, you know, fill in the blank, is really going to do it. This is the person who's really going to change Washington. And the problem is with what Democrats are doing, the term resistance has been used a lot. You know, as a student of politics, I'm more familiar with the term opposition. Resistance is something you have in, you know, Nazi-occupied Europe. It's not appropriate for a democracy. We still live in a democracy. I understand, this is my personal opinion not coming out, I understand why people find it somewhat exciting to think of themselves as part of resistance. By the way, I said the same thing about conservatives. When conservatives said that they were part of an underground, this is during Obama, I said, this is ridiculous. We're not part of an underground. There wasn't many conservatives, but a few radio hosts. I thought that was counterproductive, but it sort of romanticizes the opposition. But this resistance term is much bigger than that underground term, which was only used by 1 or 2 hosts. Resistance has now become the banner. The resistance, and by the way, I agree with Jerry Brown on this. Jerry Brown, Democrat, obviously, said that he doesn't use the term resistance because he thinks it's inappropriate. And I agree with him. And I played that up actually at the Breitbart California page because I thought that was a very mature statement by a seasoned politician. The reason resistance doesn't work is because the voters, those 1/6 of Trump voters you need to reach, are not going to be attracted by resistance. And there was a comment made earlier about the Georgia election with John Ossoff and how he's not running a resistance-style campaign in quite the same way. He's got other problems. He doesn't live in the district. There's a lot of problems. He may not win. But the lesson of his performance there is coming back to the lessons Democrats used in 2006 when Rahm Emanuel chose the candidates, and he chose candidates who reflected a conservative electorate in districts that were on the margins, and he found people who weren't necessarily the kind of anarchy, you know, and whatever, resistance, hat wearing, whatever they were. These weren't the people marching in the streets. They were people just like their Republican neighbors who wanted a change, who wanted to, as Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid said, drain the swamp. So I think you've got to find those candidates. You've got to find people who are able to present that contrast to Trump and not focus on this resistance and not play up the things that voters have already overlooked when they voted for Trump. The other thing about Democrats, okay, people defend the idea of resistance, and there's lots of things you can use to defend it. You can look at my Congressman Ted Lieu. Ted Lieu is running a page on his congressional website called the Illegitimacy Clock, where he's counting down the number of days, minutes, hours, seconds Trump's been in office, and we have an illegitimate president. This is about as resistance gets. It's been a huge success for him in fundraising. He's raked in the millions of donations, and it's also been a huge success in terms of his own voter base turning out at town halls this week and last week in LA, and you know, good for him. But he's not in a competitive district. And what Democrats have forgotten, they look at the Tea Party movement of 2010 and say, well, we're just doing the same thing the Tea Party did. They stormed the town halls. They dressed in funny costumes. It worked for them. The difference was that the electoral map was very different. The district map was very different. In 2010, despite everything you've heard about the Tea Party wave, there were only 5 Democratic seats that flipped to Republican. The vast majority of seats that were won had formerly been Republican seats, where more conservative Democrats had won briefly and then were deposed by their conservative insurgents. So there wasn't such a huge tidal wave. It was more a reversion to where things had been before 2006. The map you're looking at in 2018 is not different from the map in 2012, 2014, 2016. Democrats have very few places they can win, especially in the Senate. There are 25, if you include the independents, 25 Democratic Senate seats up for re-election, and 10 of those are in states that Trump won. So Democrats have to be thinking about how can we reach those voters who we lost in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. I'm not saying, well, there's a Senate race in Pennsylvania, but that's not going to be true in every state because not every state has a Senate race, but in general, in congressional races, whatever it is, how can we find that 1/6? How can we reach out to them? And all the other factors that were discussed, race, gender, age, that can all be part of that. But that's where you have to be thinking, and that's how you start to bring politics back to the center. One of the reasons we have a very divided electorate is that it works. It worked for Obama very, very efficiently, and Trump is basically following the Obama model. There were some comments raised earlier about how does Trump improve on these approval ratings? How does he expand? The assumption seems to be he's going to have to find new voters among Democrats. He's going to have to do some things to compromise. That's not how he's thinking. He's thinking, I'm going to do what Obama did. What Obama did was, when I couldn't get cooperation from Congress, I just did what I wanted. And I just pleased my base. And as long as you please your base and they show up to vote for you next time, you get reelected. That's what happened in 2012. Basically, the public agreed with Mitt Romney on every issue. If you look at the polls on the issues, they just didn't like him. But Obama turned out the base, in fact expanded his base, brought more base voters, especially among minority voters, to the polls in places like Ohio. And Obama just did a much better job of understanding his own voters. If you look at Trump's own voters, he's doing the same thing. He's still connected to them. And he hasn't done anything major yet to upset them. You hear all kinds of things about all the people he's hiring in the White House. Some of them were Democrats, and some of them were Jeb Bush staffers, and whatever. There's a lot of consternation in the conservative ranks. Conservatives are very worried that he's going to move to the left. Most people would describe it as simply adjusting to the process of governing. If you read Abraham Lincoln's Team of Rivals, which is still a great read, 10 years old, but fantastic book, Trump's cabinet looks a lot like Lincoln's in the sense that there are rival factions. There's all this argument. The supporters of each faction can't stand each other, but this plays out in ultimately a positive way because you have a chief executive who's able to delegate to people who understand certain issues better than he does, and who's able to take the best advice after all the arguing is done. So there's a lot of consternation among conservatives. I don't really share that so much because I look at Lincoln and others and see that this is actually normal in certain kinds of presidencies. It's not such a departure. But the real question for conservatives is he going to be the transformative president that we wanted in terms of draining the swamp, that is shrinking the size of government in Washington, getting rid of some of the lobbyists in Washington, and repealing Obamacare, doing all these things that were very important to us. Democrats could win in 2020 without doing anything if Trump fails on any one of those major promises. If Trump gives ammunition to someone like, say, Rand Paul, okay, who was very sharply anti-Trump in the early stages of the primary, later came on and endorsed him, but had a very adamantly opposed stance towards Trump and his policies, and has been a very sharp critic of some of Trump's trade policies. Rand Paul's a libertarian. If Trump makes Obamacare more government-oriented than it is now. He's going to give ammunition to his conservative base, and that 1/6 is suddenly up for grabs. If there's major scandals, I'm not talking about the minor conflict of interest stuff, Ivanka Trump's clothing line and stuff like that. I understand why that's important to people who already don't like him. It's important, and that sort of stuff should be brought up, and we all should be concerned about it, but it's not going to shift voters. If you're talking about reaching voters, you've got to find something else. So if there's a major scandal, that could also do it without much effort. But the big question about polarization is this, and I guess since I'm from the media, this is a good point to close on, and this is one of the things I think that's great about this poll, is it's so granular. You have such a huge sample size, you can really ask important questions. The division in this country is granular. It's happening on media platforms that are not controlled from Washington, New York, and Los Angeles anymore. It's not even happening on Breitbart anymore. It's happening on Facebook. It's happening on Twitter. It's happening in ways that people produce their own content. It's happening on social media, and it's happening increasingly within families, among colleagues, in neighborhoods. People are alienating and isolating each other and destroying relationships over politics. And I'm sure almost everyone in this room can relate some experience or another, whether it's a Thanksgiving dinner that was ruined or a Facebook friend who dropped you or something like that. But this is happening over and over again. And the experience of polarization is one that we're not just seeing when people show up to vote. The experience of polarization is one that's deeply felt in people's lives. And I think that perhaps for me the most surprising number is that 45% of Trump voters don't know anyone who voted for Clinton. We tend to think in the conservative movement that Democrats are more sheltered from the opposite side than we are, because we're sort of bombarded by media sources that don't agree with our perspective. But in terms of personal relationships, that tells me that the problem is bipartisan, and that people are totally cut off from any kind of normal conversation. Because certainly there are people in their neighborhood. I mean, I live in Santa Monica, which is about as left as you can get, and I looked at the numbers for my voting district, and 1/6 of the people in my voting district voted for Trump, 118 people. Now, that's very small. I mean, obviously, Clinton carried the district by a wide margin, but 118 of my neighbors voted for Trump. I don't know any of them, by the way. But they're there. The people are out there. So there's no part of American society that is completely unanimous. So how can it be that Clinton voters don't know anyone who voted for Trump, and Trump voters don't know anyone who voted for Clinton? Well, part of it is the increasing, you could say, atomization of American social life, suburban living, or whatever. But part of it is also what we're doing to each other on social media. And the paradox is we have all these ways of communicating to each other, but we tend to speak to each other less and less about the things that are important. And I think this is a great challenge going forward, is to try to figure out how to facilitate those conversations. And politicians aren't interested in that, but they're just used to using social media to reach their own voters. So Trump uses Twitter to reach his supporters. He doesn't care about people who tweet against him. He's not interested. Is there some kind of a solution in terms of what we do as Americans to try to find a way to stitch this all back together before it becomes worse, and before, remarkably, despite Ann Coulter canceling her speech in Berkeley, which also happened this morning, and all that stuff, remarkably, there's been very little violence, actually, in an age of sharp polarization. I'm not sure how long that continues. It is bipartisan, and it is a problem that is almost cultural in terms of how we behave towards each other. So I think panels like this are very important. I think this survey is incredibly important, and I'm very grateful to be here with you all. And I guess I'll expand on some of my remarks later when I'm talking about foreign policy at the afternoon panel.
Thanks, Joel. We're running behind, and I'm getting a signal that we should turn to some question and answers from questions from the audience. So there's some microphones being circulated, and maybe just raise your hand, someone will get to you.
Hi. Oh, I like what you said about millennials, because everybody thinks that we're all generic and we're all into one group and we're all left. But I'm a millennial who tends to lean conservative, but I think of myself as an independent thinker. And I just want to say, for the Democrats, personally, I didn't vote, but I was going toward Trump because nothing has been done to address the issue of us millennials. We grew up in a recession. We grew up in an economic downturn, but it only seemed like the Republicans were really paying attention to it, but they were talking about jobs more like jobs of like manufacturing, and that's more for older people. So I want to see both Democrats and Republicans, what they think about the whole economic crisis for us millennials, coming out of college with a degree and just ending up in debt. And nobody really gives you any guidance where to go or what to do or how to handle your finances. Heck, there's no financial education in the high schools, for God's sake. Who's bringing that up?
Well, my view is that you're right. I mean, that nobody's addressed that a generational problem. I do, thanks to all my friends in higher education, I get to speak at a lot of campuses and forums like this, and then my experience is that there's an enormous amount of alienation, and there's a feeling that neither party's speaking to, okay, what the hell am I going to do when I get out of school kind of problem. I think just on a campaign basis, I think campaigns are still adjusting to trying to figure out how to communicate with millennials. I find that, you know, the Democrats have, as we've talked about, Democrats sometimes take for granted millennials. Republicans say, well, you can't get them, so we're not going to go after them. So then you get into there's a void there. You know, I do a lot of ballot measures, which are not partisanly influenced. So I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to talk to millennials. And we were doing Measure M here, the transportation measure. We made a major effort. Millennials were strong supporters of M, but they didn't know what it was. We had to tell them. So we were talking to them online. We were talking, texting. Now here's a great experience. There's a difference between the millennial generation and the rest of the world. We sent texts to millennials asking them to vote for M, and I thought, you know what, we are going to get a bunch of FUs back. How'd you get my text, blah, blah, blah. And instead, we had more millennials text us back and thank us for reaching out and talking to them than we had given us the middle finger. So it's a challenge to basically even communicate for millennials for both political parties and elected officials across the spectrum.
I think the only thing I was going to add just briefly was I think there is an intergenerational anxiety, and one of the things that I've observed in the past 5 years, so going back before the 2012 and going forward, as we've recovered, economically speaking, in this country, there hasn't really been much to address the fact that we have this cross-generational anxiety going on, right? So we have millennials coming out, like you said, of college, coming out of high schools, not knowing whether they should even go to college, right, given the cost and everything else. And then you also have baby boomers, right? And so one of the things, you know, present company excluded, because I haven't read Joel and I haven't read David, you know, everything they've written for the past 5 years, let me put it that way. But I think one of the things that the way that the media often frames these things, right, so baby boomers are retiring at the same time going, you know, I thought I was going to get a gold watch, right? I've done everything I'm supposed to. So essentially the narrative is for both millennials and baby boomers, I've done everything I was supposed to do, right? I worked hard in high school, I worked hard in college, I got the internships, I did everything, and there's no jobs. Baby boomers are saying the exact same thing, right? I worked hard all my life, I raised my family, I paid my mortgage, I did all of these things, and now I can't retire. So you've got this cross-generational anxiety going on. And people are, when they're writing about this, and the media are pitting these two against each other, right? So all of the policy issues become, are we going to do free college or are we going to do Social Security, right? Are we going to do, you know, whatever millennials want for their kids, because millennials are increasingly having kids, or are we going to do, you know, Medicare reform in some kind of way? And so instead of thinking of these things as being interdependent, meaning that this anxiety that's going on is cross-generational and cultural, you know, and we need to address it in some meaningful way, not because, you know, there's some new math, but to really think about, okay, how do these things fit together, right? So that we can have everybody feeling like they're not going at each other, right? So that free college doesn't come at the cost of, you know. So I think that's one thing that, you know, neither party has really, each party has kind of doubled down on their own sets of platforms and not really addressed that there's this cross-generational anxiety going on and that people need to be able to talk about that.
So I've just, if I could just say something quickly, I've just ran the numbers here to look at what the age differences look like. And actually, the optimism among 18 to 34-year-olds is over 50% at about 56 compared to under and decreasing as you get older in the other age categories. So in some sense, the very youngest group are the most optimistic about things getting better in the time ahead. It's interesting, whereas the oldest group is the least.
Exactly.
I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. Of course, it's eating into our coffee break, but is there a last question out there?
Works. All right, so, wow. There was a study conducted by Mr. Lewandowski titled The Partisan Sort. Essentially said that most voters take cues from elites whenever they sort on the issues, whenever they become more polarized, and people tend to do the same thing with a bit of a gap. But they also said that given like media coverage and how people learn social cues and elite cues, that despite having more access to different media, they also increase their tailoring so that in a sense, their media appetite is more restricted. So if it stems from the top with elite cues and elite polarization, then there's problems at the bottom with people tailoring their news sources. Who begins the initiation of solving the partisan sort? Do the elites take the initiative and begin to open up discussion and dialogue, or is it on people themselves to begin to open up their news sources?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question for the next several years. The partisan polarized cycle that we're in is self-reinforcing. Politicians learn, as Joel said, you don't have to convert people who disagree with you. You have to mobilize your base. That was the lesson of the Obama 2012 campaign. It was also the lesson of the George W. Bush 2004 campaign, which the Obama people studied very carefully. If your strategy is based on base mobilization, you have very little incentive to try to break out of the partisan sort. And to the extent that, as people were talking about, that both parties' partisans now have become more fervent, that on the Democratic side you're talking about resistance, and so on. You get the same impetus from the bottom, so the two reinforce each other. Ultimately, unless voters demand something different from their elected officials, it's very hard to see how you break out of that cycle, because elected officials have no incentive to change what's working for them. And what we unfortunately, if you don't like polarization, unfortunately, what we see is that the voters who are most engaged in politics and follow issues most carefully are the ones who are most likely to have strongly negative views about the other side, and are most likely to be to have the most polarized opinions. So the ones who are more likely to swing back and forth are also the ones who pay the least attention.
I thought I'd never say this, but I am really nostalgic for swing voters.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I want to thank all the panelists, and it's time for a coffee break.